The thing about galactic civilization, and this was a point of considerable pride among the 14,000 registered species of the Cooperative Assembly, was that nobody froze to death anymore. Hadn't happened in roughly 6,000 years, give or take a century. Death by exposure was the sort of embarrassing relic from primitive times that sophisticated beings discussed in the same tone one might use when describing ritual sacrifice or reality television. Advanced species had evolved beyond such crude vulnerabilities, thank you very much, through the perfectly reasonable application of technology, genetic modification, and an admirably sensible aversion to visiting places that wanted to kill them. Naturally, this meant that expeditions to such places had become incredibly popular. The scientific community operated on a simple principle: if a planet was actively hostile to life, someone absolutely needed to go there and take samples, ideally while complaining about it. The research outpost on Kelvin 7, a moon whose naming committee had apparently given up halfway through, represented the cutting edge of this philosophy. Ice covered 98% of its surface. The remaining 2% was more ice, just arranged differently. Average temperature hovered at -60 standard units, which translated to insultingly cold in most civilized languages. The atmosphere was technically breathable, assuming one's definition of breathing included not immediately dying and excluded enjoying the experience. The expedition had brought everything necessary for survival: thermal regulation pods, atmospheric processors, molecular food synthesizers, emergency beacon arrays, and most critically, the unshakable conviction that equipment failures were problems that happened to other, less prepared teams. Each member wore a climate suit that could maintain comfortable body temperature in environments ranging from volcanic vents to hard vacuum. The suits cost more than most starships and came with warranties that read like religious texts. Failure wasn't just unlikely, it was theoretically impossible, according to 7 different manufacturers and one very confident insurance adjuster. Commander Vector, a thalassin whose species had evolved on an ocean world where the concept of cold meant anything below pleasantly warm, surveyed the camp with satisfaction. His second officer, Kix, a crystalline Lithan who experienced temperature through harmonic vibrations, stood beside him making sounds that approximated approval. Their xenobiologist, a Corvan named Thrace whose fur-covered body had never encountered weather it couldn't ignore, was already inside her pod running preliminary scans. The team's navigation specialist, a 6-limbed Hexian called Morrow, scuttled between equipment crates with the efficient grace of someone who trusted machinery more than instinct. And then there was the human, Marcus Chen. And yes, humans had maintained their baffling tradition of simple 2-part names, despite 6 centuries of galactic integration, was doing something odd near the perimeter. This wasn't unusual. Humans were frequently doing odd things. It was practically their species-defining characteristic, right after startlingly durable and questionable decision-making. What made this particular oddness noteworthy was that Marcus had unpacked what appeared to be manual tools. Not equipment, tools. The distinction mattered. Equipment implied technology, sophistication, civilization. Tools implied someone was planning to hit things until they achieved a desired result. Marcus, Vector called, his translator rendering his aquatic vocalizations into standard speech. The automated systems have already established our perimeter defenses and thermal barriers. There's no need for manual augmentation. The human looked up, and even through his helmet's faceplate, Vector could see that expression. That particular arrangement of human facial features that suggested the person wearing them knew something you didn't and found it amusing. Just setting up my personal space. Marcus said. Old habit. Habit. Kicks resonated, the word carrying harmonics of confusion. You have brought primitive implements to a scientifically advanced expedition as a matter of habit. Backup plans, Marcus corrected, hefting what appeared to be an axe. An actual axe. The kind of implement museums displayed behind protective barriers with placards explaining how ancestors had used them before discovering sensible alternatives. Never know when you might need them. Thrace emerged from her pod long enough to observe this exchange. The statistical probability of our climate systems failing simultaneously is approximately 1 in 7 million. The redundancy systems have redundancy systems. We would need a catastrophic cascade failure of... Yeah, I read the briefings, Marcus interrupted, with the casual disrespect for protocol that made working with humans an exercise in patience. Still bringing my gear. The aliens exchanged glances, or the equivalent thereof, given that Kix didn't technically have eyes, and Morrow's visual organs operated in spectrums others couldn't perceive. There existed an unspoken consensus among galactic species that humans were brilliant, occasionally inspired, frequently frustrating, and consistently overrated their own judgment. They had somehow stumbled into space travel through a combination of stubbornness and explosive propulsion that should have killed them several hundred times. Instead, they'd survived, joined the cooperative assembly, and proceeded to unnerve everyone by treating established safety protocols as gentle suggestions. Well, Vector said, employing the diplomatic tone that had served him through 15 expeditions, if it provides psychological comfort, I suppose there's no harm. Though I trust you'll find such precautions unnecessary. Marcus smiled. Probably right. He went back to his odd little project, and the team went back to more important matters. Science. The camp settled into comfortable routine. Automated systems hummed with reliable efficiency. Thermal pods maintained perfect internal climates, while sensors monitored external conditions. The expedition's first day yielded promising geological samples, fascinating atmospheric readings, and absolutely no crisis whatsoever. Evening descended, a relative term on a moon with irregular rotation, and temperatures dropped from aggressively cold to offensively cold, to philosophically opposed to molecular motion. Nobody worried. The equipment was rated for twice these conditions. The magnetic storm arrived at local midnight without warning, because magnetic storms were inconsiderate that way. Kelvin 7's unstable core occasionally vomited electromagnetic radiation into the upper atmosphere with the random enthusiasm of a dice roll. The expedition's sensors naturally had failed to predict this particular tantrum. Advanced as they were, the instruments couldn't account for quantum fluctuations in the moon's metallic core, which operated on principles that made physicists weep and write strongly worded papers. The first indication of trouble came when Vector's climate suit stopped working. Not gradually, not with warning alerts or degrading functionality. One moment, comfortable warmth. The next, the kind of cold that made every cell in his body file formal complaints. His suit's display flickered, died, and declined to resurrect despite increasingly frantic commands. Emergency backup systems, which should have activated automatically, remained dormant with the serene confidence of technology that had given up. Command? Thrace's voice crackled over the communication channel, distorted by interference. I'm experiencing total system failure. Climate control, communications, everything's... The channel died. Vector activated his emergency beacon. Nothing. His pod's door, which operated on electronic locks, refused to open. He was effectively trapped in a box that was rapidly achieving thermal equilibrium with the outside environment. The pod's insulation would buy him time, maybe an hour before the cold became life-threatening. less if the heating elements didn't restart. His people had engineered themselves for warm oceans, not frozen moons. His biology was already redirecting blood flow to critical organs, a survival response that felt increasingly optimistic. Outside, similar scenes played out across the camp. Keeks discovered that crystalline beings, despite their generally robust nature, became brittle at extreme temperatures. The harmonic frequencies that maintained his structural integrity began to slow, creating microfractures along his surface that would become catastrophic if the cold continued. Morrow's multiple limbs began moving sluggishly as the cold affected his neural pathways. The Hexian's compound nervous system, distributed across his entire body, made him particularly vulnerable to temperature extremes. Each limb was reporting distress signals that his central consciousness struggled to process. Thrace, blessed with natural fur, had perhaps an hour longer than the others, which meant she could enjoy the additional time to contemplate their situation more thoroughly before hypothermia claimed her too. The temperature plummeted. -60 became -70, then -80. The atmospheric processes that kept the air breathable had shut down, meaning each breath now carried ice crystals that scored delicate membranes. The backup generators, which should have activated automatically, remained as silent as the primary systems. Whatever the magnetic storm had done, it had done comprehensively. Every circuit, every processor, every sophisticated piece of technology that separated civilization from barbarism had surrendered to electromagnetic chaos. Panic set in with the efficiency of the cold itself. Vector tried every emergency protocol he'd memorized, every override command, every desperate improvisation. Nothing responded. The equipment had transformed from sophisticated technology into expensive paperweights. Worse, actually, paperweights at least maintained their shape. Some of the more delicate instruments were developing frost damage that would render them permanently inoperable. The molecular food synthesizer had frozen solid, its internal mechanisms expanding and cracking. The atmospheric processor's delicate filters had crystallized into useless sculptures. The communication channels crackled back to life sporadically, catching fragments of distress. Systems won't respond. Temperature dropping past critical. Need backup plan. Someone acknowledge. Backup plan. The phrase echoed in Vector's increasingly sluggish thoughts. They didn't have a backup plan. The equipment was the backup plan, and the backup to the backup. The concept of technology failing so completely hadn't factored into any preparation because it wasn't supposed to be possible. 7 million to 1 odds. Redundancy systems with redundancy systems. Multiple independent power sources that couldn't all fail simultaneously, except they had, spectacularly in defiance of every statistical model and engineering assurance. Approximately 40 minutes into the crisis, someone hammered on Vector's pod door. The sound was primitive, mechanical, entirely out of place. Metal striking metal, with the deliberate rhythm of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Before his freezing brain could process this information, the door mechanism shrieked in protest and the seal broke. Frigid air rushed in, which shouldn't have been an improvement but somehow was because it came with firelight. Firelight. Marcus stood in the doorway holding a burning piece of wood. Actual combustion. Organic material undergoing exothermic oxidation, releasing heat and light through chemical processes that predated civilization by a considerable margin. The human wore layers of fabric instead of his climate suit, his breath forming clouds in the air, and he looked irritatingly alive. More than alive, he looked functional, competent, prepared. "Commander," Marcus said, "you should probably come outside." "Outside," Vector repeated, his translator struggling with the chattering of his mandibles. "The lethal environment." "Yeah," It's warmer by the fire. Fire. The human had fire. Of course he did. Because apparently when humans said backup plans, they meant technology that predated written language, that predated agriculture, that predated everything except the fundamental human instinct to make things burn when cold became a problem. Vector stumbled out of his useless pod and toward the impossible sight before him. In the center of camp, a substantial fire burned with cheerful indifference to the laws of modern civilization. Flames danced upward, casting orange light across ice that had known only darkness and artificial illumination. The heat radiated outward in waves, creating a bubble of survivable temperature that pushed back against the killing cold. The fire crackled and popped, releasing sparks that drifted upward like tiny stars before winking out. Around the fire, the other expedition members huddled in various states of shock. Thrace's fur had developed frost that glittered in the firelight, which the heat was gradually melting into droplets that steamed when they hit the ground. Q-Kiss had positioned himself at the fire's edge, his crystalline structure absorbing thermal energy through resonance patterns that looked almost like shivering, his internal frequencies gradually stabilizing as warmth returned. Morrow had arranged all 6 limbs toward the flames like a biological heater array, each appendage independently seeking optimal heat exposure. Stacked beside the fire, neatly cut and arranged in a configuration that suggested both planning and experience, sat a cord of wood. Wood that Marcus had presumably gathered and processed using those primitive tools. The human himself was adding another log to the fire, adjusting its position with a stick in a display of casual competence that felt deeply wrong. He prodded the burning wood, creating better airflow, repositioning pieces to maximize heat output, performing a task that his ancestors had performed for hundreds of thousands of years. How, Vector managed, the single word containing volumes of confusion. Brought an axe, Marcus said, as if this explained everything. When the silence stretched, filled only by the crackling of burning wood, he elaborated. For cutting wood, also brought a saw, kindling, fire-starting equipment, and insulated bedding. Set up a basic shelter over there. He gestured toward a structure that looked like it belonged in a historical exhibit, constructed from branches and insulating materials, big enough for everyone. Won't be comfortable, but it'll keep the wind off and trap heat. But the fire, kicks resonated, confusion harmonizing with awe, creating patterns that bordered on reverence. You created combustion, manually, without technological assistance. That's generally how fire works, yeah, without equipment. Well, I used a lighter, that's technically technology. But yeah, pretty low tech. Spark, fuel, oxygen, basic chemistry. Marcus shrugged. Been working for a while now. Thrace's scientific mind was apparently overriding her physical discomfort. The fuel source. You acquired it from where? The environmental scans indicated minimal combustible organic material in the immediate vicinity. Cut down some of those ice-resistant trees about half a kilometer east. Dead ones, mostly. They've got this interesting adaptation where the wood develops insulating properties that make them resistant to moisture absorption, which means they burn even when everything else is frozen. Took a few hours to harvest enough, but actually, you know what, we can discuss xenobotany later. Right now, everyone should get closer to the fire before hypothermia becomes a real problem. You're all showing signs of moderate exposure. The team moved closer, drawn by heat like moths to illumination, though hopefully with better survival instincts. The warmth was extraordinary. Not the even, controlled climate of their suits, but raw and immediate and alive. It fluctuated. It required attention. It came from burning organic matter that Marcus had manually harvested using metal implements and his own physical labor. The heat wasn't perfect or precisely regulated, but it was real, and it was sufficient, and it was keeping them alive when 7 million credits worth of equipment had failed. "I don't understand," Morrow clicked, his translator rendering the sound into bewildered standard speech. "Our equipment is rated for extreme conditions, multiple redundancy systems, independent power sources. The failure rate is 1 in 7 million, Marcus finished. "Yeah, congratulations, you hit the jackpot. Magnetic storm fried everything electronic. Happens sometimes on moons with unstable cores. The electromagnetic pulse overwhelms circuit protection, cascades through interconnected systems, and boom, everything goes dark at once. You anticipated this specific scenario, not specifically, but equipment fails, always has, always will. Doesn't matter how good your technology is, there's always something that can break it. Design flaw, manufacturing defect, unexpected environmental conditions, cosmic rays, user error, act of God, whatever. So you bring alternatives." "Alternatives," Vector said slowly, his mind gradually recovering function as warmth returned to his body, "that don't rely on the same systems or vulnerabilities." "Right. Independent redundancy. If your primary and backup both run on electronics, one electromagnetic pulse takes out everything. Single point of failure. But fire." Marcus fed another log into the flames, positioning it carefully to maintain optimal burning. "Fire doesn't care about magnetic storms. Fire doesn't have circuits to fry. Fire's been working for 1,000,000 years, and it'll work for 1,000,000 more. Same with axes, saws, manual shelters, low-tech solutions for high-tech problems." Keeks vibrated thoughtfully, his internal harmonics stabilizing as his body temperature normalized. "Your species maintains knowledge of these primitive survival techniques, despite having access to advanced technology for centuries. Some of us do. Most humans couldn't start a fire to save their lives. Literally. We've got the same problem as everyone else. Over-reliance on technology, assumption that equipment will always work, belief that primitive skills are obsolete." Marcus shrugged. "But enough of us think it's worth knowing, just in case. My grandfather taught me camping when I was a kid. Taught me that tools break, batteries die, and when that happens, you better know how to survive without them. Call it paranoia. Call it preparedness. Call it whatever you want. Tonight it's the difference between freezing to death and being uncomfortable." He paused, looking around at the group. "And for the record, you're all still in danger. That fire needs constant feeding. We need to maintain it through the night until the storm passes and systems reboot. Which means we all need to learn the basics right now." The night progressed with agonizing slowness. The fire needed constant attention, feeding, adjustment, management. Marcus explained the process with the patience of someone teaching children basic arithmetic, breaking down concepts that seemed obvious to him, but were alien to beings who'd never needed to understand combustion. Wood placement mattered. Airflow mattered. The type of wood mattered. Moisture content affected burn rate. Too much fuel smothered the flames by restricting oxygen. Too little, and the fire died from lack of material. There was an art to it, a practical knowledge that couldn't be downloaded or automated or learned from a manual. The aliens learned. Awkwardly, inefficiently, but they learned. Thrace discovered she had an aptitude for arranging logs, her scientific mind translating fire management into equations about oxidation rates and thermal dynamics. Morrow's multiple limbs proved advantageous for gathering wood. Marcus had already cut and stacked, his ability to carry multiple pieces simultaneously making him an efficient fuel supplier. Keeks could sense optimal fire patterns through harmonic vibrations, detecting when flames were about to falter before visual indicators appeared. Vector mostly tried not to feel utterly useless while learning to prod burning wood without either smothering the fire or burning himself. The shelter Marcus had constructed was barely worthy of the name, a framework of branches covered with insulating materials salvaged from supply crates, open on one side toward the fire. It blocked wind and reflected heat back toward the occupants. Nothing more. No climate control, no automated systems, no sophisticated engineering. By technological standards, it was pathetic. By survival standards, it was adequate, which currently qualified as miraculous. They took turns sleeping in shifts, maintaining the fire through the brutal night. The conversation drifted in the firelight, awkward and profound in equal measure. Fear gave way to exhaustion, which gave way to something like camaraderie, forged through shared adversity. Thrace asked about human survival training, her scientific curiosity overriding her physical discomfort. Marcus explained camping, wilderness education, the strange Earth tradition of voluntarily experiencing hardship for recreational purposes. The aliens listened with fascination bordering on horror. Your people practice survival skills despite not needing them, Morrow asked, adding another log to the fire with increasing confidence. You deliberately place yourselves in uncomfortable situations to maintain knowledge that civilization has rendered obsolete. Mostly for fun, Marcus admitted, which generated confused harmonics from kicks. And because some of us figure skills are only useful if you have them before you need them. Can't learn to swim after you've fallen in the ocean. Can't learn fire starting when you're already freezing. But the statistical probability of requiring such knowledge in an age of reliable technology was 1 in 7 million, Marcus interrupted gently. And here we are. Statistics don't mean much when you're the 1 in 7 million. Plus humans have this cultural memory of times when statistics didn't matter because everyone was vulnerable. We nearly went extinct a few times before we developed agriculture. Ice ages, volcanic winters, climate shifts. Our ancestors survived because they knew how to adapt, improvise, make fire from nothing. I guess some of us feel like forgetting that completely would be disrespectful or dangerous. The discussion shifted to philosophy, to the nature of progress and preparedness. Humans, it emerged, had a cultural suspicion of over-reliance on any single system. Their history was littered with catastrophic failures of things that weren't supposed to fail. Ships that were unsinkable until they sank. Economies that were stable until they collapsed. Technologies that were foolproof until fools found new and creative ways to break them. They developed a civilizational nervous tic about backup plans, redundancy, and worst-case scenarios. Other species found this pessimistic, neurotic even. Humans called it realistic. We had a saying back on Earth, Marcus said, poking at the fire and sending sparks spiraling upward into the darkness. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Most species seem to have forgotten the second part, because we evolved past requiring it. Keeks noted, though his harmonics suggested uncertainty. Advanced civilization eliminates primitive vulnerabilities. Did you, though? Evolve past it, I mean. Or did you just build really good technology and convince yourselves that was the same thing? Marcus looked around at the group. Technology extends capabilities, doesn't eliminate vulnerabilities, just changes them. You're not vulnerable to cold anymore because your suits work. But now you're vulnerable to equipment failure. Different problem. Same stakes. No one had a good answer for that. The fire crackled in the silence, ancient and indifferent to philosophical debates. Thrace spoke carefully, choosing her words with scientific precision. You're suggesting that technological advancement creates new dependencies that can be as dangerous as the original threats. I'm suggesting that forgetting how to survive without technology makes you more vulnerable, not less. Specialization is great until your specialty stops working. Then you need generalists who remember the old ways. Dawn arrived eventually, as it generally did, indifferent to the drama beneath it. The magnetic storm had passed sometime during the night, its electromagnetic tantrum exhausted. Systems began flickering back to life with the apologetic demeanor of technology that had failed dramatically. Climate suits rebooted, running diagnostic cycles that revealed extensive but repairable damage. Pods restored functionality gradually, their heating elements slowly warming interiors. Communication channels crackled with automated diagnostics and damage reports. The team stood around the dying fire as their equipment resumed operation. Warmth returned through proper technological channels. The emergency was officially over. They were saved, in the sense that they no longer needed to be saved, because they were no longer in danger, because the systems that had failed had stopped failing. Marcus was already disassembling his primitive camp with efficient movements. The shelter came down, components sorted for potential reuse. The remaining wood got stacked and covered for potential future use, because waste not apparently applied, even to manually harvested fuel sources. The fire received a methodical extinguishing that suggested this wasn't his first time. Water from melted ice, earth piled over embers, verification that no smoldering material remained to cause problems. "You're not going to mention this in the official report, are you?" Vector asked, watching the human work. The human paused, considering. "The equipment failure. Definitely. Command needs to know about the magnetic vulnerability. The fire. I mean, that's just what happened. Kind of hard to leave out. The assembly reviews will question why an expedition team required primitive survival techniques. It reflects poorly on our preparation." "Does it? Seems to me it reflects well on having someone who actually was prepared." Marcus resumed packing. "But yeah, I get it. Politics. Someone's going to catch grief for this." Thrace had been uncharacteristically quiet, her scientific mind processing the night's events with increasing discomfort. "Marcus, I need to ask, did you expect this to happen? The magnetic storm?" "No, but you prepared for the possibility." "I prepare for lots of possibilities. Most of them never happen. That's kind of the point." He secured the last of his gear. "Look, I'm not saying technology is bad. Technology is great. I love technology. But technology is also a tool. And tools break. When they do, it's nice to have other tools that work differently. That's all. But the statistical improbability doesn't matter if you're the statistic. Every improbable event is guaranteed to happen to someone. I'd rather be prepared and wrong than right and dead." The team packed up camp in silence, each member lost in thoughts about preparation, probability, and the uncomfortable gap between the two. The expedition would continue. The research would proceed. Official reports would be filed, reviewed, and filed again. Somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery of the cooperative assembly, someone would note that humans had once again demonstrated their peculiar aptitude for surviving situations that shouldn't have required survival. Someone else would probably write a paper about it. Another would propose updated protocols. Nothing would fundamentally change because changing fundamental assumptions was difficult and uncomfortable, and implied that thousands of years of advancement might have overlooked something important. 3 weeks later, after the expedition had returned and reports had circulated through appropriate channels, Vector found himself in a supply depot requisitioning equipment for his next mission. The standard manifest appeared on his display: climate suits, thermal pods, atmospheric processors, the usual array of sophisticated equipment that had failed so spectacularly. On impulse, he added several items to his order: a manual axe, a fire-starting kit, basic shelter materials, a survival manual that hadn't been requested in decades. The quartermaster, a Kelvin whose species prided itself on efficiency and proper procedure, processed the request with visible confusion. "Commander, these items aren't on the standard expedition manifest. They're not even in the recommended optional equipment list." "I'm aware," Vector said. "Add them anyway." "May I ask the purpose? I need to justify non-standard requisitions to inventory management." Vector considered the question, remembering cold that shouldn't have existed, and fire that shouldn't have been necessary, and a human who'd prepared for a 1 in 7 million chance, because improbable wasn't the same as impossible. "Backup plans," he said finally. "Just in case." "In case of what?" "Specifically, in case the statistics are wrong." The quartermaster logged the request without further comment, though his expression suggested he'd be discussing this oddity with colleagues later over whatever Kelvins drank during recreational periods. Vector didn't care. He'd learned something on that frozen moon, something that every civilization apparently needed to relearn periodically through uncomfortable experience. Sophistication wasn't the same as security. Progress didn't eliminate problems, it just changed them. And sometimes the most advanced solution was remembering that primitive options existed for a reason that predated civilization itself. Across the galaxy, in the enormous and largely self-satisfied machinery of civilized space, no one froze to death anymore. Hadn't happened in thousands of years. The technology prevented it. The systems ensured it. The statistics confirmed it with mathematical certainty that bordered on religious conviction, usually. But on certain expeditions, led by commanders who'd learned expensive lessons about the difference between probable and possible, equipment manifests began including items that manufacturers didn't quite understand. Manual tools, fire-starting equipment, knowledge that predated starships and warp drives and the entire edifice of galactic civilization, just in case. Because the thing about 1 in 7 million chances was that someone, somewhere, eventually rolled that particular combination. And when they did, it was remarkably convenient to have a human around who knew how to cut wood and build fire and survive when everything sophisticated failed. Or, failing that, to have learned the skills themselves. Progress marched forward, as it always did, dragging civilization toward an ever more technological future, where problems were solved through engineering rather than adaptation. But somewhere in that march, a few people began looking backward, rediscovering old knowledge that turned out not to be obsolete, just unfashionable. Fire still burned, wood still heated, axes still cut, manual labor still worked. And sometimes, on frozen moons far from home, the most advanced beings in the galaxy found themselves grateful for the most primitive solutions, grateful for knowledge that predated everything they'd built, grateful for humans who remembered what everyone else had forgotten. Humanity, as usual, just smiled and said they'd tried to warn everyone. Nobody had listened, of course. They never did, too busy trusting statistics and engineering reports, and the comfortable assumption that advancement meant invulnerability. But maybe, eventually, they'd learn. Probably around the same time the next 1 in 7 million chance came around.